We actually talked at a lab meeting about this, that vaccines themselves are a remarkable component. To scientists, they seem very pure and, you're going to prevent disease, but they open up into the wider public arena and all bets are off with regards to how vaccines are perceived, used, and all the rest of it. So we sit in the academic and medical realm thinking of all the things that we do and all the noble things that we do, but the truth is that the interface with the rest of the world is actually the most important part of vaccines. It's all very well developing them in a laboratory, but how are they going to impact and make impact on the planet? What I want to talk today about is one vaccine in particular towards the end, which is the human papillomavirus vaccine, which is a vaccine for particularly for cervical cancer, but also for head and neck cancer as well. And the fact that it's now out there, but actually the uptake of this, you can imagine you guys won a Nobel Prize for this. 2 companies have worked round the clock to develop it. They bring it out to the world. What's the uptake? I mean, it's minimal. And there's been a lot of concern about why that's the case and what's happening out there. People, I'm sure if you ask people, do they want to prevent cervical cancer, people will say yes, but would they be willing to have a vaccine which has been proven to be safe? Maybe not. And I think these are the intangible public health and also governmental issues that are sort of, I'm going to touch upon in the talk. Now I want to plug where I come from and what some of the people here are from, which is the Vaccine and Immunotherapy Center. We're based in an academic hospital where our mission is to develop new, broadly applicable vaccines for infectious diseases and cancer. That's what we do. We have 4 objectives under there. Obviously, to innovate, coming up with new things. We work together between academia and industry to get things done. We try to get things done as fast as possible because the academic story is generally a lifetime of hard work, and it doesn't necessarily fit the pace of, in the vaccine world, of emerging infectious diseases that, let's say, like H1N1 flu arrive 4 years ago, 5 years ago. You need a vaccine within 6 to 10 weeks, and you're not able to do that for like 2 years, and by the time you get to the vaccine, the pandemic is over. So speed is of the essence of vaccine development, and some vaccines have taken a few years, others have taken 10, like the HIV vaccine has taken decades, and we still don't have one. And then the final objective, which Chris and I are more and more sort of in tune with, not that it's, they're all equally important to us, but education, in other words, projecting the word about vaccines or the understanding of vaccines out beyond the walls of an academic institution. I think we're very bad at that. I think we love our academic institutions so much, and we're protected by this sort of ivory tower mentality that we think we're doing what we need to do, but the public don't really know what we're doing, and they don't know exactly how we go about what we do, and then they don't know the results really of what we do. And that's going to be, it seems to me, importantly epitomized by a few lessons that I'm going to highlight before I get into the vaccines themselves. So just the 101 stuff: vaccines are immunologically efficacious agents that result in prevention of specific infectious diseases. So we know all the vaccines that are out there: smallpox, meningococcal disease, all the nasty diseases that they can prevent. And basically the vaccine imitates infection in certain ways without infecting you, but causes you to develop an immune response that stops you from being infected and suffering the ill effects. And that's sort of a fundamental point. You may know that the first vaccine was effectively the smallpox vaccine, which was developed several hundred years ago, before any virology was known and before any immunology was known. So vaccines have a very long history, and in a way, the fact that vaccines were developed without any knowledge of immunology or virology, considering it's a smallpox vaccine, which is a virus, that led to a sort of what's called an empiricism, where people could almost use guesswork to work out how to make a vaccine. That's, to some extent, still in the field to this day. The other important point is safety plays a primary role in the design, development, and delivery. And in America, in the US, that's grown to be more important than efficacy, which is an extraordinary statement. But the H1N1 vaccine, which was developed as rapidly as possible in the US after the swine flu breakout and so forth, the main thing they were focusing on was safety. So they sacrificed efficacy for safety. They didn't add anything to it that would improve the immune response. They'd shown in vivo that it generally, in kind of living people, that it generally generated a sort of a rather pathetic immune response to the virus. However, they were willing to vaccinate, however many, 60 to 100 million people with the vaccine as quickly as possible, just to do it and be safe at the same time. So the world has got to a very interesting place where safety is important, and then below that is efficacy. So it has to be safe first and then efficacious. Now, why is that significant? Well, there's sort of three lessons from these vaccines that have been developed, and I've spoken with those from my lab. I've spoken about the last two, but I'll bring all of this together. Safety and efficacy, and the perception amongst the public about the safety and efficacy of the vaccine are very, very important. Unbelievably important, mythologically important. And smallpox, when the vaccine first came out, so Edward Jenner, he was a doctor working in the sort of farmlands of England, of the English countryside, noticed that milkmaids who milk cows and so forth did not develop smallpox. They developed cowpox, which were little blisters on their hands because they got the virus version of smallpox in the cow's udder, but they didn't develop smallpox. And he made that phenomenal observation that when there were big smallpox outbreaks in England, the milkmaids were not infected. He made that observation at a time when a lot of people probably thought that people got smallpox because there was some evil spirit in the city of London that exercised. And I'm not joking. It was at that time. Now, he came up with the idea that if you scrape the lesions of the milkmaid's pox lesions, and then scrape them into the arm or I'm not sure if he started with the arm, it might have been the leg, of a person who had never been exposed to cowpox, that person would develop a cowpox on their arm or leg, and then they wouldn't get smallpox. Now, smallpox was killing 30 to 40% of people that had been infected, and a lot of those people were children. So this is a really big need. In the countryside of England, there would be waves of smallpox, and kids would be killed by it. So this is, he'd come up with something that was really, one, it was revolutionary, and two, it was going to have an enormous impact in society. What was the uptake, do you think? Pretty close to zero. People were frightened that he had taken something from an animal and was applying it directly to the skin of a human. Even in that day, it seemed kind of scary that someone might have done that. Secondly, the press at the time, and I was just thinking about this walking over here, the cartoons and the press, we sort of live in our own time in the 21st century, late 20th century, 21st century. I live in the 1960s when I was born, but were as active in a pulp fiction, nationalistic, way as they are, as much as they are now, as the tabloids are today. I mean, you could go back to England in the 1800s and find newspapers that ridiculed every aspect of society, just like the National Enquirer does today. There's nothing new in that. And the press got hold of the story that there was a doctor in the middle of the English countryside taking things off cows, putting them onto humans, and kind of doing fakery to protect people from smallpox. And the thing I wanted to show you were the cartoons that were being drawn in the newspapers. The newspapers were the thing that was principal way that the whole of the British Isles was informed about things, just showing the ridiculousness, you know, like applying the backside of a cow up against a person's arm so you're protected from smallpox, you know, a doctor with a stethoscope, you know, just ridiculing. And as a result of that, the uptake of smallpox vaccine was absolutely minimal for the first 5 to 6, 7 years of the invention of it. And all of that time, Jenner and his team were refining it so it contained as much of the liquid of the smallpox and none of the cow. You know, they were concerned about that too. So what was the breakthrough there? The breakthrough, and it tells us a story for our time, the breakthrough was the royal family in Britain decided unilaterally to vaccinate all of their staff. And just like Massachusetts General Hospital and Partners Healthcare now is one of the biggest employers in New England, the royal family in those days, back in the 1800s, had a huge staff. And you've all seen Downton Abbey. I mean, that was one family of like 6 people, and they had like 30 people looking after everything from polishing their shoes to curling their moustache. I mean, you know, that was the type of staff. So the royal family had literally thousands of people spread across the country, working in their royal houses and farms and properties and so forth. And they systematically vaccinated all of it. They had Jenner, you know, visit each of these places, the Buckingham Palace and all the palaces, and he administered the vaccine to all of these thousands of people. That story got out into the press. The royal family are vaccinating their people. As you may or may not know, all the royal families of Europe are all related to each other. It's like one enormous inbred sort of system at that point between the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Germany, all of them, but Greece, you name it. So once the Queen, outside of the Queen or the King, I think it was the Queen at that time was doing it in England, all of her cousins in the other royal houses in Europe started to do it. Well, if it's okay for them, the British, and they've survived it, will do it. And so it started to spread. And one of the next biggest influences was Catherine the Great in Russia. And her household was even bigger than the British household, and they vaccinated tens of thousands of people. And people saw that it was safe, and the people who were vaccinated didn't get smallpox, even though there were waves of smallpox. So that tells us a lot about vaccines. You see, as doctors, we would say, like Edward Jenner must have said, well, we came up with this vaccine. What's the matter with you? You won't accept this. We learned from that the influence of public opinion, even before the cat's out of the bag, even before the vaccine is even used. The public is thinking about what this means, and the press are thinking about it, and everybody else is thinking about it, and they're not thinking about it like Edward Jenner's thinking about it. They're thinking about it for other reasons. Lyme disease is another story which I really just only heard the details about on NPR this morning driving in. And I told my lab about this. I just think it's such an extraordinary story. A Mass General doctor here, Dr. Alan Steer, 30 years ago discovered Lyme disease. So people all across New England would develop rashes, they'd develop arthritis, some would die from their heart stopping and fevers and all the rest of it. And no one knew what it was caused by. People thought it was a rheumatological condition. Well, this doctor identified the pathogen, which is what's called a spirochete. It's very similar to syphilis, the disease, the bacteria that causes syphilis. He identified it, he understood it, and after 20 years started to develop a vaccine against it, which again, to him, with his house in Cape Cod, no doubt, he was thinking this is going to be, you know, people will want this vaccine. And he was persuasive enough about that that 2 big drug companies then went off and commercialized it and developed a vaccine around it. And when there were first what we call phase 1 and phase 2 trials, and the vaccine was tested and all of that, and it was proven to be safe, and then it was starting to be introduced into the general public. And a group of people who were against the vaccine came out and said this is associated with far too many side effects. We know people who've got joint pains and fevers and all the rest of it, and that's making them sick. And at that point, the FDA took the story back up and reviewed all of the data and then said, no, that's not the case. Those were not related to the vaccine, and there was a sort of a clearing of the air that the vaccine was safe. But the companies had got so anxious that there might be a perception that this was an unsafe product, and in fact there was a class action suit which was being developed at the time. They just stopped production and distribution of the vaccine. And the second company who was going to do the follow-on vaccine just brought the whole thing to a halt in Massachusetts. There is now no human Lyme disease vaccine available. You can't go into a doctor and ask for the Lyme vaccine, even if you've just decided yourself on the basis of the literature. Why? Because the companies are not producing the vaccine for humans, which is produced at a certain level. Now, if you have a pet dog or a pet cat, you can go to your vet and get the vaccine. There's the regulation of that, and no one seems to give a damn about whether dogs get vaccinated or not. But the point is that, again, perception played an extraordinary role in this. You know, as soon as there was a whiff of a class action suit, drug companies, you know, with their history, they don't want to have anything to do with it. The other company don't even want to get into it. And the next thing you know, there's no Lyme disease vaccine available. And it had already been proven to be 85% efficacious in preventing Lyme disease. So, you know, that is impactful in terms of the absence of the vaccine. It's a potent vaccine. So it has echoes of the smallpox case because of the involvement of the press, but it also has an important component of the time we live in is of vocal, what would I call, sort of action groups who are active, vocal groups who in our society have a self-amplifying voice. So a small voice can become a very, very big voice through the systems that exist. And then there's also the legal profession. There are class action suits and people who might be sitting at home thinking, well, I had a Lyme vaccine, but I never thought about the arthritis, and then they see on television, if you had the Lyme vaccine, there's now a class action suit. If you had any symptoms like this, do phone 1-800, whatever. That's the reality of the society we live in. It's a real world. So that has had another impact on the perception of the vaccine, which has closed the whole thing down. The third one, which I'm kind of almost, it's closest to my heart because the story started in England, was the standard vaccine for children was measles, mumps, and rubella. That was, the children received it at an early age and boosted and so forth. And these are three diseases which are, I don't know, no one's as old as I am, but certainly, you know, there were kids at school when I was at school who got rubella and got mumps and got measles and stuff like that. And must be about 5 to 10 years ago, a very eminent scientist, medical scientist in the UK, published a report that MMR was associated with autism. Very compelling story published in The Lancet, which is the premier scientific journal of the UK. Very, very significant. He'd studied 10,000 children and found that there's a significant increased risk of autism amongst children who'd received the MMR vaccine, and he separated out all the other factors that could have affected the child's development and all the rest of it. It seemed like a perfectly wonderful study. The press got hold of it. It's a huge study because it's a huge impactful thing because MMR had been churning through the population for decades. The children, suddenly, oh my God, what have we been missing the whole time? And it was coming at the beginning of the time when people were becoming aware of autism, which is a very, to parents as I am, it's a very disturbing thought to think about that your child's mind could be affected in such a dramatic way, and here's a vaccine that could actually spark the whole thing off. That rages on in the press, and in the same way, on the positive front, the royal family of England adopted smallpox vaccine. The Prime Minister of England, Tony Blair, a few months after the report came out, he was on camera and they said, are you having your child vaccinated with MMR? They said that, you know, on TV, amplified across the globe. He said, no, I'm not going to have, I wouldn't have my, you know, it's like a gut, paternal, fatherly thing. I'm not going to have my kids vaccinated. That went all over the UK and then all over the world. and MMR started to be sort of shelved in terms of pediatric vaccines, people started to wave their arms and go, well, maybe if we divide them up and we give children, one day they come in for measles, and then 6 weeks later they get mumps, and then they come back for rubella, and then they come back again for, you know, you just make the sequence much more complicated, but you get them all vaccinated. That happened. The companies continued to make MMR. Interestingly, in America didn't bat an eyelid and just continued to vaccinate with MMR. It was very interesting. They never stopped MMR. I think Satoshi has a daughter also. They got MMR here. It never stopped. It never penetrated. It certainly penetrated across Europe, but not over on this side of the Atlantic. Anyway, that story raged in the press for years. And it had a big effect. There were measles outbreaks, mumps outbreaks at schools. I was an infectious disease physician at the time back in the UK. There were outbreaks that hadn't occurred for decades. Anyway, a few years ago, some scientists went back to this original piece of work and found out that it was fraudulent. That in fact, the scientist, this very eminent physician scientist, had fabricated all of his data. That in fact he'd done the study, but then he had fiddled the data that suggested that there was a relationship. And there's actually a precedent in history. I don't know if you know about the famous Scandinavian twin study, which influenced education for decades, where they found that they took the Scandinavian eminent professor had taken identical twins who'd been separated at birth and looked at their IQs. So one twin would have been raised, let's say, in Stockholm in a city, and the other identical twin had been raised in let's say, the countryside in northern Sweden. And he looked at their IQ and their intellectual development and documented that, you know, the predominant effect of being identical was on your intelligence, so the genetic makeup. It didn't matter if you went to the countryside, you still had the same IQ as you did when you grew up in the city. And if you went to sort of like a low-income kind of public school, and because your parents were poor, but you were an identical twin of another twin who went to a high-level private school, in the end, your IQs were very close. So it argued at its time, this was in the 70s, at the time I was at high school, that education was more about your social development than your intellectual development, because look, if you separate kids who are identical, they still end up with the same IQ. So in the end, school is about socialization more than about education. It really influenced education. What happened? You know, the whole society turned over, the educational system was revamped because of that study. 10 years later, another serious scientist went and looked back at these records. Only 2 of the 60 identical twins that were reported actually existed. The 58 other ones that made this all a big significance had been entirely fabricated by the scientists. So, but what's the point I'm trying to make is what's interesting in both of those stories, and you're kind of reacting to them, it sort of tells me a little bit, is that the ending of these stories is not really very well known. The beginning is known. MMR was associated with autism. Everyone knows, I don't know, maybe you guys don't know, but there was a big thing about it. But very few people know that in the end, that was a total load of rubbish. And that it wasn't actually related. And so the spin out of the story, which may happen 10 or 20 years, is sort of lost into the ether, but the original story still sort of carries a certain amount of status. And so from that point of view, what this type of talk is about is trying to get the educational piece out about vaccines, so that people have a much, I mean, this is Skillshare's approach, is to democratize education. People know more equally. I know it because I read the journals about what happened about the autism report. I know it because I followed the story because I'm an academic working in a hospital. But I don't think that really permeated society very heavily. So I think that what this is about is getting that out there. So come now to the specific vaccines here. One of the democratization points here about the educational piece is that I do believe people have forgotten what these diseases are that MMR, I mean MMR is like a cute acronym, or diphtheria, diptech, these things are like, they're actually really serious diseases, and I think we've really genuinely forgotten it. Certainly as doctors, when we see a patient with a rash like this, it takes us a while to go, ooh, could that be measles? And only the older generation of doctors say, yeah, it is, because 30 years ago, 40 years ago, I've seen that. That is measles. So we've forgotten what those diseases, we even have to remember, oh yeah, measles, that can be associated with a form of encephalitis, so we better make sure that this person doesn't have that complication. We don't, nowadays we just think of MMR, the vaccine, we don't probably, M for measles, Measles is a severe childhood disease which has a high complication rate and a mortality rate. We've sort of forgotten that. Rubella similarly has a whole set of complications for more morbidity than mortality. Diphtheria used to kill 5 to 10% of young children every wave that it went through New England before the vaccine and before antibiotics. It just would come in, parents would lose a proportion of their children in the family. It's difficult to understand that parents were losing children to these sort of infectious diseases on just a regular basis. The mortality rate of children below the age of 10 was highly significant, and I was reading a very interesting book that my brother got me, which was a report written in 1776 by the medical profession in Boston at the end of the War of Independence, and they were reporting what the state of the health of the new nation was. And they reported that yet another wave of diphtheria had taken, a good proportion of the children in Boston. And the disease in diphtheria, why it shows the mouth of the child, is that you basically get a very severe inflammation at the back of the throat, so severe that it obstructs the airway, and the child will die of asphyxiation if not treated. And the rate of disease in this state is, in other words, it gets to this state in children is very high. So in olden days, if you just had enough airway functioning, you could get through the disease, your immune system got going, and you would survive. If you were weakened by malnutrition or your immune response is in a poor state, then you would die. And obviously children with small airways were extremely vulnerable, because the airways at that age, in the age up to 5, are very tight anatomically. If you get inflammation, you can just close off the airway. It's so toxic that the toxin that diphtheria produces, which is called diphtheria toxin, the thing that you get vaccinated against, is used to kill cancer cells. It's such a potent toxin. One molecule that can kill a cell. So this is, when we get our diptet, or our children getting a diptet vaccination, this matters. This disease is unpleasant. Now, it's not to say that nowadays, if it was recognized in time, there are antibiotics that can be used to treat it, and obviously airway support and all the things we have now. And I just include smallpox because, although it's been eradicated on the planet, it was a much, in its time, you can see why Jenner was determined to eradicate this disease. And you can see why the world was determined to eradicate this disease. Again, the mortality rate amongst children is probably about 10 to 20% if they get, smallpox. Obviously, amongst adults, there's a survival rate, but it's infectious, it has high mortality amongst the young and elderly. So the vaccination meant a lot. The other diseases which are important and that are, certainly when I grew up, there were children who had been affected by polio, and there were adults that, we knew who had been affected by polio, which causes this damage to the nervous system of the legs and arms, and also to the chest. And I don't know if you've seen these slides or documentaries of, they used to have hospitals with what were called iron lungs, because you couldn't breathe yourself. There were just patients lined up who got polio, their chests were paralyzed, and they were stuck in an iron lung for the whole of their lives because they couldn't breathe. Their rib cage muscles were basically paralyzed. Tetanus remains a deadly disease throughout the world, and uptake of the tetanus vaccine, there are all sorts of programs to increase the uptake of the vaccine. And then whooping cough, which when I was training, there were still sporadic cases of whooping cough that we see as a dreadful, dreadful disease. Its name isn't just about the cough, but it's about the fact that children get exhausted and coughing at the rate that they cough when they get whooping cough, and eventually suffer respiratory arrest because of that. So these are all diseases, apart from smallpox, that are still out there. And someone currently asks me, well, if we don't see it very much, it doesn't mean that it's sort of slowly disappeared from our environment. No, all of these things are out there still in the environment. It's just we're heavily vaccinated, and also there are good treatments and ways of at least monitoring these conditions, but they're all still out there and not yet eradicated. So the main focus, kind of from a vaccine point of view, is the HPV vaccine, because it's a new vaccine, and the point that I want to get to is around the uptake of the vaccine, because it has been so low, and given the work that's gone into developing it, and the fact that it's got a very good safety profile, I'm sort of kind of keen to at least get the information out about the vaccine. HPV is a virus. There are many types of HPV. Certain types of the virus cause cancer and genital warts. More than 99% of cervical cancer is caused by HPV infection. Cervical cancer itself is a very prevalent form of cancer across the globe, and again is a cause of much illness and mortality on the planet. And needless to say, just like Jenna didn't get the Nobel Prize, but you know, the discovery of this and then the subsequent work on the vaccine won a Nobel Prize, but we're wondering, you know, have we made enough impact from that? And here the disease is really, in the case of cervical cancer, is the infection of the cervix and mucosa, or the lining of the cervix with the virus, and then that sets off a process by which cancer develops in the cervix. There's obviously this clear link between the virus and cancer, and then the other one is that certain types of the HPV can also infect the back of the throat and cause cancer, what's called head and neck cancer. And it's a very severe disease, predominantly in men. So cervical cancer is predominantly in women. Head and neck cancer is predominantly in men for some reason, and both of them have severe consequences. Head and neck cancer, obviously, because of the the structures that are involved, it's difficult to deal with surgically, with radiotherapy, chemotherapy. It's a very severe disease. Genital warts are prevalent across society. HPV, like all the other viruses, know no boundaries between class or whatever, and it infects male and female genital tracts. It establishes long-term infection. There's a slow change that occurs in the cervix as a result of HPV. Screening is good to detect these changes that the virus institutes and allows us to intervene. And in the US, about 4,000 women die from cervical cancer each year, and 12,000 are diagnosed each year. And that's just in the US. The vaccine that's being developed is being offered to children, girls above the age of 10 or 11, to protect from genital warts, cervical cancer, from spreading the virus. It could be offered to boys. There's a current, I think the FDA or another regulatory organization is now recommending that doctors do recommend it for boys, but frankly, no one was quite sure why it was just recommended to girls in the first place. It made sense that it should be recommended to girls and boys, but it's taken time for the regulatory authorities to realize that that's the case, and now doctors are recommending it for boys over the age of 10 as well. There are two vaccines out there. One which is 3 injections over 6 months and covers 4 types of the cancer-causing HPV, and the other one covers 2 types. The 2 types that overlap here are the ones that cause 96% or more of the cancer. So they both predominantly cover the forms of the virus that cause cancer, and they cover the ones that cause cervical cancer and head and neck cancer. So they're equally, efficacious in that regard. I think it's important, given the story about smallpox and the story about MMR, talk about the safety. So this has been used in hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people now, and this is FDA guarded language. It induced pain, swelling, itching, bruising, redness, fever. If you go into the website on Gardasil and look under rare side effects, there's really nothing there. There was a time at which, in the Boston press, a child had received the Gardasil vaccine and then developed motor neurone disease, which was a disease that affects the nervous system of the body. And there was a little burst of, well, maybe this vaccine causes severe neurological disease. It was published. The medical profession interestingly, immediately reviewed the case very carefully. And there was genetic risk factors in the patient and in the family for degenerative neurological disease that emerged after careful review. However, it's very interesting. I gave a few lectures at schools recently because I've been asked to talk about this because parents are very concerned. The first question was, what about that case of that kid? I heard about it. Didn't he get paralyzed by getting Gardasil? First thing in your mind, first thing asked about. We had to go through quite a long discussion, and what it came down to for this lady, for her child, was that I said what the evidence was, and then she said, until my, best friend's friend who's a pediatrician said that she would have her daughter vaccinated, I didn't feel comfortable to have my daughter vaccinated, but now I have. So this is the reality of the way that the human interacts with vaccine technology. It's really complicated, really, really complicated. And even as I address the question, I can see even just the discussion unsettling. Maybe people don't like, I'm going to get my child vaccinated, and just the discussion unsettled the audience about, well, would I really, get my child vaccinated or not? The other vaccine is Cervarix. Fainting can happen. The side effects, pain, redness, swelling, are, again, from a doctor's point of view, are common with all things delivered by needles into the skin, or 99% of them. You get some sort of pain or some sort of reaction sticking the needle with chemicals into your arm. So as a doctor reading that, you go, we give people a lot of things into their arm, and a lot of them develop that. So the association with fatigue, headache, muscle pain, upset, these are commonly, if you looked across all vaccines and a lot of drugs, you would see that these are the commonest side effects that people report one way or another about pretty much everything. This is why, in the same time as we're talking about conditions like MMR, half the population will be infected with HPV in their lifetime. So this is a significant disease, and I had the pleasure of working in what was called an STD clinic, a sexually transmitted disease clinic in London, in the centre of London. And that's another non-mystery to me as a doctor that maybe should be shared, is that, the fact is that was the busiest clinic in the whole of London compared to the rheumatology clinic or anything else. So thousands and thousands of people coming through that clinic every day because people have sex. oh yes, I mean, you know, that's such a surprise. But within the medical community, that's known. And what's ironic to me is, for example, the sexually transmitted disease clinic at Mass General used to be a little outbuilding. That's classical for hospitals. They used to put the sexually transmitted disease piece of it, like off on the edge. They didn't want to, you know. And there's a very famous, it was called a Hospital for Disorders of the Skin, which was in Soho in London, which was the red light district, still is the red light district of London. And it was called St. John's Hospital for Disorders of the Skin. Actually, it was, in its time, the biggest sexually transmitted disease hospital and clinic in the whole of the world. But it was for disorders of the skin, you know, and people understood that as that. So we live in a time where it's often put up this, half people will be infected with HPV, you know, during their life. You're like, oh, how is that possible? But the truth is that, you know, the population of the world will not be expanding, not for the fact that people have sex with each other and as a result transmit infectious agents, now one of which is preventable. There's always this statement to make, which is that HPV vaccine doesn't protect you against any other sexually transmitted disease. That is another interesting misconception which, although maybe informed people would just go, of course it doesn't, it's the HPV vaccine, but I can tell you, working in that SVP clinic in London, seeing hundreds and hundreds of patients, I realized that was a common misconception, that a single thing could sort of protect you from anything. I guess before the vaccines, people would consider that penicillin alone, you know, if you had penicillin, you could protect yourself against anything. So that was it's a common misconception, and although when we read it on the information sheet for a vaccine, we kind of go, well, that's kind of obvious. But it's interesting that even in the 21st century, certainly when I was doing my work there, it was the late 20th century, people were still under misconception that any of these things could actually be preventable. HIV, chlamydia, you wouldn't get pregnant, all sorts of stuff. Fascinating stuff, which was as true then, and I'm sure it's true now. And still, of course, the most important thing that we stress is that safe sex is still the appropriate message. And when I was talking at schools, you have to, beforehand they told me, you know, you also have to talk about abstinence as a, you know, you have to, in our time, you have to talk about safe sex messages and abstinence as a way of avoiding the infection. So that's my talk. I'm happy to take any questions. I really appreciate you coming to hear it. I hope it was informative for you, and thank you very much.
Question?
Yes, sure.
For the MMR vaccine, so when they learned that it was, there was a link between it and autism, so yes, the first thing that the doctors did was to split the three of them.
Well, so the first thing that happened was they stopped vaccine.
They stopped.
Yeah.
But then they split it. How does splitting the vaccine? Because what we think, because the vaccine had the three components.
I know.
So how does splitting it make it better?
Well, so there was word on the street that one element, some people believed it was the measles element, some people thought it was the rubella element. So it gave people a choice to go, well, I'll have the rubella and the mumps, but I'm not going to have the measles. And in fact, measles was the commonest thing that was dropped, and constant, because part of it was that, well, measles can cause neurological disorders. Therefore, the vaccine, maybe that triggered a neurological disorder, like autism. Therefore, I can get the MR, but not the M, the first M, as it were. So it gave people a choice, and you know, as you can imagine, after a report like this, doctors were in a real quandary what to recommend, because they had thousands of parents turning up saying, well, should I, shouldn't I? And at the time when the study was believed, it's difficult to know what to say. So following it, there were several outbreaks, particularly of measles and mumps. And then, little by little, people went back to, some people went back to just the full MMR, others to the split vaccine. Obviously, people were, actually a colleague told me recently that he had, as we were talking about this talk, had a lot of colleagues who phoned him in America. He's a pediatrician, Ivy, Shaw Warren, He said he got a lot of calls saying, well, what are the Americans doing? And when he told them, well, the Americans don't recognize this study right from the outset, that sort of reassured some parents. So there was another word coming around on the other side of the Atlantic saying, come on guys, this isn't that compelling, and the diseases we're trying to prevent are more significant. I think the other thing was that MMR, from the American perspective, have been around for a long time, and no one had raised this issue before, even if significant neurological complaints as a result of the vaccine. So I think there was sort of, they believed the longer-term body of data. Yes?
I can't remember, I know that I've read about and seen documentaries and things about HPV in like school districts, and like having it be a potential requirement for public school children to get that when they come of age. And I was wondering if you know what's going on with that now, like if there's anything.
So the vaccine is being offered but not required at the moment. It's the parent's choice, and you can go to your PCP or whatever and ask for it, but it won't. It's being encouraged, but the uptake, as I said, of the say 100% of people who could get it, the uptake is about 20 to 30% currently. Yeah.
The HPV vaccine, you said, is split like over 6 months.
Yeah, 3 doses over 6 months.
You get 3 doses.
Yeah.
So is there a specific? It's a two-sided question. So is there a specific reason? Because I don't really know.
Well, yeah. And so just to quickly answer that. So yes, to get to protective levels of antibodies, it's been shown that you need 3 doses over 6 months to get to that.
Yes. And the other one is something I've heard already from some other people. How do you really assess that if you vaccinate somebody, that the vaccine actually took effect? Like sometimes they say that many vaccines that go to the third world, by the time they get there, through the treatment that they receive and the temperature change, they're already not working right. So is there a way, like if you vaccinate somebody to really know, because the person knows that he or she's been vaccinated, but how do you know as a clinician?
So there are serological tests, you can draw blood. I mean, this is a problem, obviously, in the developing world, that you vaccinate, and then how do you go after everyone who's vaccinated, get the serum? So you're doing this thing of assuming that the cold chain, as it's called, is intact. So it went from one cold area to another cold area to another cold area, and then was introduced into the person, right? So that has been checked as it's going along. And then the efficacy is good enough actually to generate this herd immunity. There are enough people vaccinated against the disease that will actually offer herd immunity to the small percentage of people who are not immunized. And that's what they want to get to with HPV. Their aim is 80% uptake or 90% uptake, so you could get herd immunity.
One last question. For the HPV, you gave the case for Gardasil of the child that was diagnosed with this other disease. So do you, because I know that nowadays a lot of people are going towards medication tailored for your genetic background and everything.
Yes.
So could there be an interaction for this specific child, for example, with the vaccine? And do you recommend, like, for vaccines, for example, to go towards that?
So the whole purpose with vaccines is that generally conceived for infectious diseases, that you're going to be vaccinating millions of people. And so the personalized vaccine approach for infectious diseases really hasn't caught on. The personalized piece, I think, is associated with what people perceive as their own personal risk. So, in other words, they'll personalize what they think is the risk for themselves. So maybe a person will think, I'll never get HPV, and consequently they won't think it's worth vaccinated. Or I think most commonly, I mean, these are studies done, parental perceptions of when their children are going to have sex. I mean, I don't think, that's their perception of it. The reality is, whatever it is, I don't know what the latest statistics about kids over the age of 15 and, how many have had sex before they're 18, let's say. but what matters is the parental perception of that risk. And I remember at the talk, some of the parents said, oh, my little Bobby won't ever, you know, I don't see him, you know, they have like a 10-year-old or something, I don't see him, you know, mixing with girls until he's 26 or something like that. You know, people have their own view of what their risk, their particular risk is. And as we know, many studies, people are very poor at judging their own personal risks. You know, in terms of long-term assessments, you know, what is the long-term risk to you of getting HPV? It's kind of difficult for a parent with a 10-year-old child to work out what that really is. We do know that half of the population will be infected with HPV, which to you and I might say, well, scientifically, that sounds pretty good odds that you're going to get infected. 2 out of 4, 1 out of 2, you know, that sounds like pretty significant odds. That would guide someone with, you know, that sort of mathematical projection, you know, extrapolation would make that assessment, but that's not necessarily true of the general public. And then even amongst scientists, you might go, well, I know what the science is, but when you're talking about my child, you know, that's different. I think we all can relate to that kind of feeling that it's all very well talking about this thing in the grand scheme of things, but yeah, when it comes to you personally, maybe you behave slightly differently. So it's a great question, and it raises huge public health issues about perception of risk and how you approach people's perception of risk. In my view, is that the only thing we can do is get the information out as broadly as possible, so people at least have been told what the information is, that they know the autism study was a hoax, that they know that HPV is, you know, half of the population is infected, you know, these type of facts, and just leave it then to see, you know, what happens as a consequence of that. Okay. Oh, yes, sorry.
What strategies do you think would be best used by academia, the medical establishment to address, you know, concerns and misinformations of somebody says, comes with questions about, you know, HPV or another vaccine, and read something on the internet?
So what happens currently is very interesting, and this is where I think Chris and I are trying to get more of this out, is we get, as doctors, we get a letter in the post from, it's not the FDA, but it's from a governmental authority saying, here is the latest word on HPV and neurological disease, and we read it, and what we're expected to do, we're just expected to do this, is to, when we see our patients, we'll have read this thing, and if a patient asks a question, we'll say, well, the latest word. But I'm not sure how effective that is, so it's a very internalized system. It's not like posters are put up all over Boston saying, this is the word currently. It's coming to professionals, and it's part of this view that, well, professionals can handle the information and process it and distribute it to their patients. But given the types of stories we've talked about, I don't buy that as the whole way forward. There's some sort of alternative approaches, but at the moment that's the way it happens. Is some sort of thing comes out of some governmental authority written in real government speak, hedging everything, and then you go and see your patients, and if you remember what you saw, like there was a thing about Lyme vaccine I received, you know, a year or so ago, saying what the word was on the Lyme vaccine, because at that point people had received the vaccine, but now it was being stopped, so patients were coming in saying, hang on a minute, I got the Lyme disease vaccine, am I going to die? You know, so you're given the information to reassure the patients that no, the studies show that it was stopped because there was, you know, there was a perception that there was a risk here, although it didn't materialize in bigger studies, that kind of view. Okay.
Actually, I think that HPV vaccine is probably one of the most expensive vaccine right now, right? So, that this is a slightly different topic, but is there any thought to decrease some of the cost? Because I think the probably target would be some developing countries, because HPV is more prevalent in some developing countries.
So that's a very good point. So it is very expensive, and the neat things about being out there have been some efforts to reduce the cost or subsidise the cost of it, but at the moment it's still quite expensive. Okay, thank you very much.